Bonjour, hi, and welcome back to another episode of Matthew's Always Wrong. And today I want to talk a little bit about a topic that's very deep to most Canadians' heart. I want to talk about Indigenous issues. Now, the reason why Indigenous issues are so contentious in today's, political climate and just overall sentiment as a whole when looking at Canada is because people seem to believe that Canada's creation was only founded off the destruction, the assimilation, and overall the ruining of Indigenous cultures and Indigenous tribes. We came here, we conquered, we colonized, we then forced them to assimilate, we murdered them, we stole their lands, and then we put them on reserves. And now they're all dying on the reserves because the federal government can't do anything right. And I want to just talk a little bit about why I think that's such a, to a certain extent, a flawed argument. I'm not here to say that everything in history was great. History, for the longest time, was horrible to a lot of people. It was bad to women, it was bad to the Indigenous, it was bad to a lot of people. But to say that today, that if you are Indigenous, if you are a woman, if you are black, if you are Hispanic, if you are an immigrant, you're gay, you're disabled, whatever it may be, to say that today you don't have the same rights as anyone else is flawed. It's wrong. It's simply not true. It is illegal to hire someone to hire someone based off the color of their skin, off their sexuality, off their religion, whatever it may be. It is illegal. And in the cases that those things do happen, not only do I condemn it, but also the law condemns it, and the institution, the organization, the company that has those policies are taken to court and are charged for it. But to say that today that systemic racism is a prevalent issue in society, yeah, there's systemic racism against white people, against white Christian males, but nobody wants to talk about that. Instead, what they want to talk about is how the Indigenous people have been massively oppressed. We've stripped them of their culture, their identity, and we forced them to assimilate. You can't force someone to assimilate. Yeah, that's what's happening right now, and guess what's happening? Guess what's happening? We tell all the immigrants that come here that they don't have to assimilate, and guess what happens? We're getting wiped out. There's a cultural genocide going on, and it's not against Indigenous people right now. So it's the same people who say that, look, Canada was founded off of oppression, off of disregarding the opinions, the values, and the belief systems of the Indigenous people. And to a certain extent, yes, that did happen. However, here's what really happened. All right? The colonial settlers that came here, they fought a war. They fought against the native people. And guess who lost? That's the reality of the situation. We always want to talk about how, it was a genocide. It was all these things when, one, there was very little proof. Two, the media loves to spin arguments. And I'm gonna back up all these claims a little bit later. The media loves to spin all of this to make it look as bad as possible. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the entirety of the situation that Native peoples have been experiencing. Not only that, but then you have any attempt to glorify someone in a historical context, someone like John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, someone who was instrumental in creating the nation that we exist in today, one of the most, ideally, one of the best nations on the planet. And yet, statues of him are being taken down, and yet we're taking him off the dollar bill and replacing him with these other people. That's not to say that he didn't do bad things. Everyone back then did bad things. That's just how history works. Every culture, every person back then did bad things. You know, you want to say that white people were the only perpetrators of quote unquote crimes against humanity, when in reality, every single culture in the entirety of history has done it. Every country, every tribe, humans tribalistic in nature and have been fighting forever. One of the main constants in human civilization is war. You want to look at the Middle East. There's been conquest. There's been fighting all over the Middle East because of religious ideals that are still going on today, religious values. You look at Asia, where there's been tribes and tribes and tribes that have constantly been fighting for thousands of years. You look at South Korea and Korea as a whole, who had one of the longest unbroken chains of slavery in the history of humanity. You look at pre-European Europe, where everyone was a slave. In the Roman Empire, doesn't matter what race, color you were, everyone was a slave. So to say that white Europeans are the mass perpetrators of all this inequality, and then you're ignoring the fact that the societies that were built upon Western colonial ideals, Christian ideals, are not the most prosperous nations in the world today, is flawed. It's a very flawed argument to say, well, look, there was all this injustice in the past, so we should tear down all civilizations that came from it. One, you'd have to tear down every civilization ever. But two, you're ignoring the fact that you live in literally the best conditions possible. You're living in your suburban household. Your parents have 2 cars. You know, your parents are married. You have brothers and sisters. You go to an education system that allows you to express freedom, free speech, in most cases, ideally. You tweet on your iPhone. You consume media that was made by all these organizations. So the standard of living that you've become accustomed to living to, was entirely created off of this system that you're saying is inherently racist. And yet, show me the proof where black people, Hispanic people, indigenous people don't get jobs based off of their race or the color of their skin. It doesn't happen because it's illegal and is fundamentally against the Charter of Rights. And to say that all organizations are systemically racist or systemically biased against a certain group of people, especially minorities, again, is unfounded. There's no proof for any of this. There are instances of racist people. Yes, there are instances where there is discrimination, and yet it's almost like we have a judiciary rubric and a judiciary system that is put in place by who? Who put in those places? Who's the countries that advocated for ending slavery? Oh, it was the United Kingdom. Oh, let's ignore that fact. The UK is systemically racist, so we have to bring in every migrant of the third world ever. But again, look, there's an entire system that is based off of persecuting people who are causing racial injustices or biases. So now I want to get to the indigenous issue, and this has been really contentious because the media loves, and everyone seems to believe in this argument that Canada has destroyed indigenous culture, has destroyed the way of life for the natives who lived here, and yet, where's the proof? One of them, and this issue came up because of, really brought it to light to me, was because François Legault, the Premier of Quebec, made the announcement that they're going to be investing $92 million into opening a new museum in Quebec. And what's the museum about? Well, it's about Quebec history. Now, everyone's getting mad at him because they're going, is it going to include the indigenous people? Indigenous people are part. What do you consider Quebec history? And then he clarifies it. He goes, well, who founded Quebec? It was Jacques Cartier when he came to Canada and discovered Canada in 1534. Well, there's a momentous occasion. Then, a lot of years later, when Samuel de Champlain came in 1608, he founded Quebec. So François Legault is basing the history of Quebec, more specifically, the history of French-speaking Canadians who are now identifying more as Quebecers. Because if you look at Canada as a whole, there's not a lot of French speakers outside of Quebec. Yeah, there's some in New Brunswick, there's some everywhere else, but if you look at French speaking in Quebec where it's 80% versus any other province where it's more like 10-20% French speaking, you kind of see the rationale behind creating a museum that commemorates this type of history. So yeah, now everyone's getting mad. They're going, he's not going to include the indigenous cultures. And when asked about it, he did say it. He said, look, French Quebec history this museum is about Quebec as a nation, right? And though I may not agree with the separatist ideal of nationalism for Quebec, there is definitely a nationalism and a deep, thick, strong cultural history behind it. And now everyone's going, well, what about the indigenous people, right? And yeah, the indigenous people did help a lot of the settlers. They did help and were part of the history. And that's exactly what he said. He said, yeah, there will be indigenous people, but everyone's claiming that for some reason he's going to be historically erasing these people, which isn't true. But the whole purpose of this museum is we don't need another Truth and Reconciliation museum. We don't need another museum about how every single historic event in Canada also affected indigenous people. If you go to any museum, like you go to the War Museum or you go to the museums in Ottawa, what are they about? You look at the History Museum, it's a section about how it affects most of Canada, and then also another section about how it affected indigenous people, as if it didn't affect these people the same way. The Great Depression led to mass unemployment for indigenous people. Yeah, it led to mass unemployment for everyone. What's your point? So this one was really this museum, which is going to be opening in 2026, again, it's surrounded around the history of French-speaking Canadians, around Quebecers. And are there Quebec indigenous people? Yeah, those people will be included. But to say that, what about the history of the land before the settlers? That's not what he's talking about. It's like making a museum about, British people in North America, and then claiming that there's not enough black representation in it. No, it's about a certain ethnic group. It's about a certain cultural group. Yeah, the indigenous people were there. They were there. They were also there before. And did they build anything? No, they didn't build anything. Oh, but their traditional value, And this got me interested in the whole topic. Because you go through any education system, especially in Quebec, and I'm assuming also all around Canada, there's this massive push by the educational system to educate all the white students about how much tyranny the indigenous people had to go through and how bad our ancestors were to these people. And it talked about, and there was a massive focus about, they weren't able to vote until the Indian Act, and most importantly, the residential schools. And the residential schools, from what I was taught and what all the media tells you, is that these were these mass centers of cultural genocide, which is the term that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission used. Cultural genocide just means that people had to assimilate. That's literally the only meaning of it. So you could use there's a difference between cultural and real genocide. But the way that they're using this language, it makes it seem like there was a mass genocide of indigenous people in residential schools and in Canada as a whole, when that was not the case. Cultural genocide just means when somebody has to integrate into a broader society. And, there's a difference. Is it bad? Yeah, to a certain extent it is bad. But in terms of Canada, which is based off of, housing immigrants and housing all these people, yeah, there should be a consensus towards what Canadian culture is and what Canadian identity is. And then if you go to the other extreme of cultural genocide in preventing it by saying that nobody has to integrate, nobody has to assimilate because you should be able to keep all your culture, which again was a lot of the basis for the Multiculturalism Act in the 1970s. But look at what's happening now. Now you just have a bunch of different ethnic groups, people with different backgrounds, people of different races, who all come together in their own pods, in their own communities, in their own groups, and are basically becoming isolated from the broader society. And as we continue increasing immigration to higher and higher levels, these communities grow larger and larger. They grow so large to an extent where the people who come in now, they won't even have to learn English, they won't even have to learn French, because the entire basis of everything they do is with other people around them. And if you don't have people integrating and assimilating into Canadian society, what happens? Well, Canadian society tends to break down. Societies tend to break down when, you have all these foreigners who don't want to integrate. Guess what happened to Rome? There was a lot of factors about that, but, that's a parallel that can be made. So you're looking at this and they're going, it's a cultural genocide, and then you have all the media talking about it. And they're going, how bad all of Canada was and how bad the government was with relations to Indigenous people. And then things really started to heat up in 2021. Why? Well, there was a quote-unquote groundbreaking report that showed a lot of anomalies and a lot of places where residential schools used to be. And for those of you who don't know, residential schools were essentially these taxpayer-funded schools, generally run by the church, so the Catholic or the Protestant or the Anglican churches in Canada, that were used to give education and help Indigenous people assimilate. And now the broad narrative is that from the age of 4 years old, the government and the church people would come into native reserves. They would steal the children and put them in these sleepaway schools, because the residential schools, you would sleep there. You would also be, and then they would be sexually abused in these schools. They'd be stripped of their culture. They'd be forced to learn and accept Jesus, which that's such a bad thing. And then they'd get raped, and then they'd die, and then they'd mass buried all these kids in these mass graves under the schools. That's basically the narrative that was being told. And then this narrative was just augmented when they used LiDAR and they used ground-penetrating radar, and they found what they called anomalies, which they just assumed were a bunch of mass graves. And they're saying in 2021, using these technologies, that they found 215 bodies on an apple orchard field where a residential school used to be. And this sparked massive outrage amongst the communities, amongst the media, and especially provoked a response from the government. Justin Trudeau now spending billions and billions of dollars in the guise of reconciliation. Only problem is, and for anyone who lives in Canada, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, this idea that, these residential schools were these places of mass terror and mass destruction for all these people, is simply a false one. It's not true and does not reflect the entirety of the situation. Residential schools were opened in the mid 1850s, and the last one closed in 1996. And again, they were run by the church, they were taxpayer funded, and they were meant to, what the people who founded these things, sure, some of it was assimilation, which was almost necessary if you were going to live in a mainly white society, in a mainly homogenous, nationalist, white society, yeah, maybe it would be good for these people who, on reserves, their levels of education were much lower, the levels of crime and the levels of literacy were all, crime was up. People weren't reading that much. People were poor, and drug use was rampant, which is still real today. So the residential school was made as a tool to help these kids gain a better education, learn French, learn English, get a bunch of religious teachings, and learn about the history, and make friends, learn skills that would be valuable, like cooking, cleaning, and all these other things, as well as have a place where they could be with all other people that were around them who are part of the same tribe as them, or whatever it may be. So I just want to go back. What happened to those 215 bodies? Well, just want to point out, 0 bodies have been recovered so far ever from any residential schools. There have been no mass graves. They have never found anything. The entirety of all this media coverage and all these attacks on the church and on the government were based off of anomalies found in the ground through ground penetrating radar and LiDAR. So no proof has been found to actually prove any of these, these allegations. But people seem to just go with it. The government just wants to go with it. I think as a PR move, because the media has been so voracious on this topic, and indigenous rights issues are some of the most, they're complicated, and they're some of the most ferocious topics when looking at Canadian politics. And no government official seems to be able to, fully make everyone happy, because you do have some indigenous tribes which are like, look, build a pipeline in my neighborhood so that we can start making some royalties off of it. And the other ones are going, the environment, right? And another reason for the mismanagement of native reserves is also because Indigenous affairs are a government, a federally organized thing. So it's the federal government that takes charge of all these people. And then recent news about residential schools came out, which really was very interesting to me because it didn't fit with the main narrative. And what happened was that they, at Kamloops residential schools, they used LiDAR and they found anomalies in the basement that mass graves were present under the basement of the school. So what did they do? They got $8 million from the government. They excavated the basement, and guess what they found? Nothing. They found nothing. They spent $8 million, which they don't want to disclose to the government. We have no idea how that $8 million was used. And the people who were responsible for utilizing that money for the excavation and for the research also don't seem to want to disclose where that money went, which is kind of interesting. But the most interesting fact, obviously, is that there were no bodies found. No bodies still have been found ever in any residential schools. And now people go, when you tell people this, they'll go, well, look, we do know kids died at these residential schools. Roughly 4,000 kids died. That is a fact. However, let's take into account a broader context about not only the time and, the numbers as a whole. So 4,000 deaths out of 150,000 students who attended. Okay? What did those kids die of? Disease? There is no mention of if these kids were abused to the point where they died, were they murdered, or did they die of disease. There's no mention of that. They just say there's 4,000 deaths. Okay, let's look at the time period. This is 1850s onwards, right? What disease would be prevalent? Oh, all of them, because we haven't discovered penicillin yet. A lot of medicines hadn't been invented yet. So a lot of people died from tuberculosis, from smallpox, from diphtheria, from TB. All of these diseases, which the media says tuberculosis was massively rampant in all these residential schools, ignoring the fact that tuberculosis was rampant everywhere in Canadian society. So it's these types of arguments and these claims that, look, 4,000 people died. It must have all been from sexual abuse. No, actually, it was probably just a bunch of diseases that killed people because the medicine at the time had not been invented yet. Then, what a lot of people say is that these people they were forced to go to these schools, right? They were taken when they were really young and they were forced to go to these residential schools. And I'm not saying that wasn't the case sometimes, but in the vast majority of cases, and what the media does not look to and what does not want to highlight is the fact that 150,000 students who ended up going to residential schools was roughly 20% of the total school-aged population of Native people in Canada. So you have 20%. If this was a mass rounding up of people and forcing them to go to these schools, would that have been higher than 20%? Yeah, probably. 20% is a very low number. It's like boarding schools today, charter schools today. Maybe a little bit more prevalent, but it's the same fact. Not only that, day schools were also introduced as a viable alternative. You would only have to go to the residential schools if there was no day school, which is just a normal school on the reserve or elsewhere that was present. Then you'd have to go to the residential school. And even then, you had to get parents' signature and everything. And then also, it wasn't just Indigenous people who had to go to these schools. There were a bunch of mixed students, there were a bunch of white students, and there were a bunch of, immigrant students that also went to these schools to get a higher level of education. Which, again, the media won't tell you. That is a narrative that's been lost. But yeah. Also, in a lot of cases, what they like to portray is that it was a jail. You weren't allowed to leave. You couldn't see anyone. You couldn't visit anyone. You were taken away from your family, and you'd never see them until you were 18 again. Again, that's not true. A lot of these schools allowed for kids to go visit their parents during the weekends, leave on Friday, come back on Sunday for church. And in the cases where they weren't allowed to leave, it was likely because a lot of these Indigenous places are sparsely populated, especially in the northern parts of Canada. A lot of these places are very sparsely populated and very far and very hard to travel to. So it would make no sense to allow a bunch of kids to go see their parents if their parents live 200 kilometers away every weekend. So that's another narrative that they love to push, that you couldn't actually do anything. And again, it's another false one, as usual. They keep lying. I've been telling you about all of this. The media keeps lying. And we just keep eating it up. And anytime we get any other types of information, we just want to ignore it. We go, it's so bad. Again, I'm not saying that there wasn't some abuse, there wasn't some death, there wasn't some schools that were bad. But that's like any school anywhere. Look at the deaths on reserves versus in the residential schools. That's a number people should be looking at a little bit more. So the goal of these schools, again, was to help assimilate these people in a white society by increasing their levels of education, because in a lot of cases, a lot of these reserves didn't have the necessary levels of education that would be needed to help these kids flourish. And the media always talks about all the negative parts about these schools, when there were a lot of testimonials of kids who made lifelong friends, connections during these schools. And a lot of times, even when they were no longer forced to keep going to the schools and they were allowed to leave, a lot of them stayed because they wanted to continue their education. Because it's a free, imagine if today you'd be given the opportunity to have free housing, free education, free healthcare, free food, all of these things together in a mass community of people your own age and basically the same culture. Now, a lot of these people couldn't speak French, they couldn't speak English, and these schools would be a great tool to help them assimilate into broader Canadian society. Did the schools maybe go a little bit too hard in terms of forcing down European mindsets? Maybe. But a lot of these kids still, it's another narrative where they go, these people wouldn't be able to speak their own languages at the school. They'd be beaten if they spoke their own language. If you wrote with your left hand, they'd beat you up. They'd smack your hands with rulers. Yeah, that's what they were doing everywhere at every school ever in Canada. They do that on anywhere. If you wrote left-handed, you'd be hit. If you spoke back against your teacher, you'd be hit. Corporal punishment was a large part of schools at the time, and it was not something that was just unique to residential schools. Oh, but the food was bad. Sometimes the food be poisoned. All these narratives. Yeah, you got free food, you got free housing. You'd be able to learn a bunch of skills. You'd make lifelong friends. You'd make all these connections. Were there bad cases? Yeah, but there's bad cases everywhere. Some kids were bullied in school. Some people, they didn't like their school experiences, and that's just a reality of the situation, that out of 150,000 people who go to somewhere, not everyone's going to enjoy it. But the fact that the media is overrepresenting these cases by a factor of like 1,000 is not representative of the whole situation. And now I want to talk a little bit more about the sexual abuse claims. So if you look at anywhere, you do a quick Google search, the first thing you'll find is that apparently sexual abuse was massively rampant in all these schools, and apparently all the priests were raping all the kids, which is something that's been very popular to say in media against the church. That's just the reality of the situation. But they're saying, here are most estimates that were able to find in a quick Google search, was that between 30 and 70% of students face sexual abuse. That's a massive number. And you're telling me over 113 years of these schools, of people entering and leaving, that barely any allegations came by about these alleged sexual abuses? Why is it that it's only been in the last 2 decades where now apparently everyone got raped? Boys, girls, apparently they were raping boys even more. All right. Independent researchers from the University of Victoria, this woman, she does a research and she finds that it's a lot more likely that these are just a bunch of opportunistic people who want to get government handouts. She's saying that it's more like 3% on the high end of students face sexual abuse, which is too high. Yes, it's too high to have any sexual abuse in any schools, especially, and those people should be taken to justice, of course. But there's been sexual abuse in normal schools. There's been sexual abuse everywhere. Again, I'm not saying that these things didn't happen. I'm just saying that they're being overrepresented and being used to attack a certain group of people, Christian whites, to make them look much worse than what was actually happening. Was sexual abuse too high? Definitely. But is sexual abuse too high everywhere? Also true. And those people should, if you're a priest and you rape a kid, you should be given the death penalty. I actually think that current laws in Canada don't go strong enough and don't go hard enough to attack these types of people who are not Canadian, who should be revoked. If you come here, right, as an immigrant, you commit any sexual crime or any crime at all, you should be deported, just like if you are born here. And you know what we should do? We should send anyone who has sex with kids, send them to Gaza, let them fight. That's what we should do. But yes, you'll see saying on the high end, it's more like 3% of people. Because it's very interesting. Look, you've had these things from 1850s to 1990s. And then apparently all the allegations come out very recently. And why is that? Well, the government, part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings, this was founded by the Stephen Harper administration and the Mulroney administrations. They decided to just give massive, instead of going through massive amounts of court cases and clogging up the entire judicial system, they decided that they should just, we'll just give out a big $5 billion. Just take the money and a bunch of more money for all the quote-unquote victims. So what would happen is that you'd have all these lawsuits, and then you'd have these huge piles of money where if you were a claimant, if you were sexually abused or harassed in one of these schools or abused, you'd get quite large paychecks, tens of thousands of dollars. So what did you think was going to happen? You have a lot of cases where you have all these people going, yeah, I face sexual abuse, but then they don't give names. They don't give specific times or periods of times. They don't go into detail about what actually happened. So when looking at real sexual abuse cases, yeah, they kind of know the details. And then when asked about the people, their peers and the other students in their classes, a lot of them also go, yeah, a lot of them were sexually abused. Again, without any facts, maybe based off of what they heard. And maybe a lot of them are just opportunists who just want big checks from the government. And why am I saying all these things? Is because this narrative has been extremely detrimental towards the brand of Christianity. The Christian brand has been decimated in Canada, besides a long line of decline for the church, but also because of this. This is likely the main reason why Christianity is such a, badly looked upon religion in Canada, is because of apparently all this rampant abuse and all this attacks on the Indigenous people. And in response, since 2021, when these first mass graves findings were introduced, do you know how many churches have been burnt or vandalized since then? Over 100 churches were burnt or vandalized since 2021. That's just a coincidence. All right. Only two out of the 33 churches that were burnt to the ground were accidents. All the other ones, 31 out of 33, were because of arson. Then you look at and then you can make the argument, yeah, but you don't know who's doing this. Okay, let's look at the vandalism. Over 60 schools were vandalized, where rocks were thrown through the window, where people would spray paint graffiti and they'd write, dig them up, or shame on, all these other things that kind of link it quite well to a lot of these issues. So because of the media's narrative that Christianity and Canadian society as a whole has been so detrimental to these people, guess who's taking the blame? Again, the people who they want to take the blame. Do you not see the pattern that started emerging? They don't like white people. They don't like Christian whites. They don't like straight Christian whites. Break down the institution of marriage. Break down all these other things. Break down your communities and make you think that you're the enemy. You are not the enemy. I'm here to tell you that. So, that's basically what's been going on with the residential schools. And I'll talk more about this in a bunch of other episodes. But it's very interesting to me how well the media has a grasp on this and how well these Indigenous commissions and societies have control over the narrative that's been going on. Because from what you've heard, you'd believe that there is a literal genocide against these people, that these residential schools were concentration camps where you'd go, you'd work, you'd get raped, and then you'd die, and then they'd mass bury you under the churches. When again, no bodies have been found. You search it up, they'll say mass graves everywhere. You actually read the articles, it's just LiDAR and ground penetrating radar finding quote-unquote anomalies, which could just be rock formations, which could just be weirdness in the ground. And then they'll just claim those are mass graves, even though they haven't excavated most of them. And the ones they have excavated, guess what they found? Nothing. Another waste of taxpayer money. And then a massive issue when it relates to the indigenous people is also the fact that because the federal government takes charge in all these things, that there's going to be some more mismanagement opposed to if you had the provincial governments who ran these things. So how reserves works is that you don't actually own, in most cases, you don't own the property you live on. In fact, it's all what's called crown lands. So it's in the name of Her Majesty, the Queen, or the former Queen. It's all federal land that you can't actually own. And that's a massive issue for a lot of these people because you look at the reserves. Yeah, there are some of them that are wealthy, but a lot of them, there's chronic mismanagement when looking at housing, when looking at the water situation, the electricity. And poverty is a lot more rampant and people are a lot less well off. And one of those issues is that because you can't own a home, you can't get a mortgage to fix up your home, you can't refinance any of these things because you don't actually own the house, you don't own the land. It's a lot harder for people to build equity in all these situations. So how do we fix this? Well, maybe let the government, big brother government, tell them to fuck off. Tell the government that maybe the indigenous people can do things on their own. Here's what I would propose, allowing for a free market system where people can buy and sell the land and the houses within reserves. But, you want to make the argument that it'll just be bought up by a bunch of colonizers, or these neo-colonizers, as we're called now today. Why not just let the people in the reserves have to vote on every house sale or land acquisition so that they can choose what they want to do with the land instead of having the government think about what they want to do and have maybe just a few indigenous people around Justin Trudeau tell them what they think the entirety of every indigenous culture wants. That's just a thought, though. And again, I want to talk a lot more later on about it, but today my main thing was on the residential schools. So yeah, just a small recap. No body's been found. Cultural genocide and a real genocide are two different things. Cultural genocide is just assimilation. Apparently, what we should be doing is just culturally genociding every immigrant group that comes in here. That's just a thought. It's so much more different when you're talking about foreigners versus people who were here. Even though they lost the war, we came in, we beat them, we signed a bunch of treaties giving them some land. Then as we expanded, we signed more treaties, gave them different types of lands. And then as usual, big government messes everything up. That's why I'm an advocate for smaller government. Hashtag conservative movement. Hashtag Canada One. So, yeah, that's basically everything I have for today. Thank you so much for listening. And as usual, maybe I'm always wrong. Probably am. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.